Okay, good evening. Can everyone hear me? Welcome everyone to Evanston Public Library, and thank you for joining us tonight in spite of the weather and also virtually. Hello to all of our online viewers. My name is Susan Markwell. I'm the acting head of the Lifelong Learning and Literacy Department here at Evanston Public Library. That's the part of our library that coordinates the mini course series with the Northwestern Emeriti organization. This has been a productive partnership now for the past 4 years and a total of 12 mini courses since 2018. We look forward to continuing this collaboration into its 5th year, starting this coming fall. A quick reminder from our course coordinator, Jeff Garrett, that session 2 for tonight's mini course will now be taking place on May 4th at 6:00 p.m. instead of next Thursday, April 27th. He apologizes for the need to reschedule, but he overlooked that next Thursday, the library will be closed for staff training all day. That session will also be available via Zoom or after May 4th as a recording. You will be receiving link information for both the live Zoom and for the recording. So welcome everyone. We wish you a great time this evening. And now let me turn things over to Mary Poole from NEO. Mary will be introducing your instructor.
NEO is also delighted to be continuing the partnership with the Evanston Public Library. Tonight is that better, Mike? Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Tonight is the first session of our mini course, Sacred Places, What Gave London, Paris, and Florence Their Allure. Dr. Richard Kieckhefer is a medievalist, an historian of religion, and an expert on church architecture. He is Professor Emeritus of History and John Evans Professor of Religious Studies at Northwestern University. He has been honored by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His books include European Witch Trials, Their Foundations in Popular and Learned Culture, Forbidden Rites, a necromancer's manual of the 15th century, Magic in the Middle Ages, published by Cambridge University Press in Spanish, German, Polish, Czech, Italian, Greek, Turkish, Portuguese, and Korean. And always a favorite, There Once Was a Serpent, a history of theology in limericks. Please welcome Professor Richard Kieckhefer.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I have been going around speaking with people in the audience here, meeting with old friends, making new friends, and sharing travel stories. It is always interesting to me to travel through space and to visit places and to travel through time and to see what things looked like in the distant past. And then to come back from these distant places and these distant times and to share my experience with other people. So I've been doing that already and will be doing that this evening, and we'll look forward to hearing what other people have to say about their experiences. You will recognize this as being neither European nor medieval. But I began my study of the Middle Ages back when I was in college in St. Louis, back in the 1960s, at a time when the St. Louis Arch was still under construction. And I still remember vividly being asked to a dinner party with some friends in St. Louis. 2 young women who were roughly college age at that time, roughly my age, and their father and mother, who were a bit older. And in the course of the dinner, conversation turned to this arch that was being constructed. The daughters insisted that this was a total waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of resources. And their father was kind of tutting them and saying, no, 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 you young people do not understand how important these things are for civic pride, for giving a sense of the dignity of the community. The daughters would have none of it. I was sitting there not responding to the argument at all, but I was not surprised years later to discover that this argument had been going on for a long time. If there was any one person who was chiefly responsible for organizing the drive to build the Gateway Arch, it was this Luther Eli Smith, who kind of chaired the committee and did a great deal to articulate the purposes of the Gateway Arch. The idea was to commemorate the men who made possible the expansion of America to the West: Jefferson, Lewis, Clark, all those hardy hunters, trappers, frontiersmen, and so forth. And what's unspoken here, but understood, I'm sure, by many, is that Lewis and Clark began their exploration of the American West, began it and ended it more or less at St. Louis. So St. Louis was the gateway to the West in that sense, if not in other senses. There were people who asked Smith, do we not need practical things more than this folly, this arch? To which Smith responded, yes, but spiritual things are also important. What? Spiritual things? One might have thought that the old cathedral at St. Louis, one of the few things left standing when they cleared the ground for the Gateway Arch, one would have thought of that as a spiritual thing, or the new cathedral, which is surely the best place in North America to see mosaics. There's a spiritual monument for you. Or even a statue of St. Louis himself might have been thought of as an appropriate monument to the spiritual background of the city of St. Louis. But an arch? In what sense is that a spiritual monument? Well, I think what was probably going on in Smith's mind, in the minds of other people, and perhaps the mind of the father at that dinner party back when I was a hapless undergraduate at St. Louis University, privy to this debate about the merits of the arch, what was going on in their minds probably was something like this, that the values symbolized by the arch are values that are sacred or perhaps spiritual, in the sense that they are deeply rooted values important to us as a people. The value of exploration, the value of expansion of the country, the value of treating those Native American peoples so respectfully. All of those values we hold sacred, and the way those values get expressed in symbols is also a kind of sacred marker, because religion and the sacred is always something that we deal with in symbolic terms. So no doubt that is what Smith and others had in mind when they considered the arch to be sacred or spiritual. And indeed, if we look around, we find that many other monuments of civil religion are sacred in those senses. There may be no overt reference to the transcendent, to God, the saints, the angels, but it is the hallmark of civil religion to be focused on these reminders of values that we consider basic, we consider perduring, we consider fundamental to our culture, and these values are commemorated in symbolic terms. That is, kind of in a nutshell, what we mean by civil religion, which need not have explicit reference to the transcendent, to God, the saints, the angels. But if we back up in time to the pre-modern era, we find that the period in which the cities of Western Europe. Some of them came into being, others were revived during this period. And there was a commercial revival that made possible a revival of the towns, the cities. And during that period, very roughly 1000 to 1500, when the towns were becoming wealthy and powerful and self-governing. If you're wealthy and powerful, that means you're sacred, right? Well, that's what people wanted to believe. And during that time, there was something closer to consensus about transcendent values, about religion. And the vocabulary of self-representation, meaning by that the way people talked about cities and the way they represented cities in art and in architecture and in ritual, that vocabulary of the sacred, that vocabulary of self-representation was largely taken over from the churches. So that if you were building a town hall, as here at Prague, you would have a bay window showing where the most holy part of the chapel was. You might have towers resembling church towers. If you were building a town hall during this period, almost inevitably you would have a chapel in the town hall. So the vocabulary of self-representation, even in a secular location, tended to be taken over from the church. Communal identity was sacred identity in the sense also that there were patrons and patronesses who protected the community. Here we have a representation of the city of Siena, with the Virgin Mary extending her mantle over it in a time of earthquake. But she would also extend her mantle over Siena or some other place in times of war, in times of plague, in times of famine. Places were sacred because they had sacred patrons who could look after them and whose patronage, whose protection was eagerly sought. The local church and the local town government tended to be closely intertwined to the point that in many places it was difficult to distinguish between the governance of the church and the governance of the town. I have here just one example, Esslingen in southwestern Germany, just a little bit east of Stuttgart. Back in the Middle Ages, it was far more important than Stuttgart. And we have here 3 of the churches of Esslingen. It is built in the Neckar River Valley. So I am standing here up on the lip of the valley, looking down onto the town of Esslingen. And we can see the great old parish church of St. Dionysius. We see St. Paul's Church, which is probably the earliest Dominican church in Germany, earliest church of the mendicant Dominican order. And then off to the right, you can barely see it, but up on the steep incline that leads out of the Neckar Valley, there's a chapel which was built chiefly for memorial masses for the dead. So you would have chantries, people donating money so the priests could celebrate mass for the dead. That's what this chapel is chiefly designed for. Okay, early 14th century, there is a document issued indicating how the clergy are to devote their time and provide services for St. Dionysius, the parish church, and the chapel of Our Lady up on the incline. This document specifies, it regulates how the priests are supposed to serve in this memorial chapel. It specifies that all the clergy from the town are supposed to participate in the major festivals, Sunday, feast days, processions of all sorts, that is St. Dionysius. And this document is issued in the 1320s by the local town council. Wait a minute. What's going on here? It's not the bishop who regulates the clergy. It's not the pastor or anyone else of the parish church. It's the town council. Who gives the town council that right? Well, the town council gives the town council that right. Just as town councils in many parts of Western Europe were increasingly seeking and often obtaining the right to appoint their own clergy. They provided the money for church building. They provided the money for all the furnishings of churches. And if they're providing the money, that gave them a measure of control. So in the later Middle Ages, the boundaries between church and state, well, we like to think that there is a barrier, a wall of separation between church and state. That's the way we think of things, but it's not at all the way they thought of things. So in these towns of Western Europe in the high and late Middle Ages, the symbols that give us some indication the way people thought about their towns, their civic history, their civic identity, the identity of a place like Florence or Bruges or London or Paris or any of these places, those symbols tend to be religious symbols. They didn't build these abstract arches. They built churches, they built statues that had transcendent, explicit transcendent reference. And even today, if we go to Western or Central, or for that matter, Eastern Europe, and look at the monuments that tend to be the major symbols of these places, they're not always, but they are in many cases religious symbols. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. That is, of course, the bell tower at Pisa Cathedral. Often overlooked, but that in fact is what it is. And so with Munich and Rome and Paris, we know how heartrending it was when Notre Dame at Paris caught fire, because it is such a powerful symbol of Paris and so many of the different things that Paris stands for. When you have symbols of a town, often there are legends connected with them. And when you go to San Marco in Venice, you'll ask yourself, well, okay, it's dedicated to St. Mark, obviously. Why is it dedicated to St. Mark? Because they claim the relics of St. Mark. How would the city of Venice have gotten the relics of St. Mark? Well, there are stories about that. Stories that were developed chiefly in the 12th and 13th centuries about how, first of all, it is assumed that Aquileia was the main ecclesiastical center of northeastern Italy for centuries. But the claim was Venice had inherited the ecclesiastical dignity, the hegemony, the ecclesiastical hegemony of that part of the world from Aquileia for complicated reasons. But not only that, the relics of St. Mark had been miraculously discovered and transported overseas to Venice. And not only that, but we are told in a late 13th century source that when St. Mark was traveling around the Mediterranean and adjacent seas, he happened to be sailing back past this place that would become the city of Venice, and an angel appeared to him and told him, hey, Mark, guess what? That's where you are going to be buried sometime, or at least your relics will be enshrined. And you will be treated with honor in a city called Venice, which is going to be right over there. And he looked over across the waters and said, that's really nice. The angel was right. Yeah, the bones of St. Mark, the relics of St. Mark did end up at Venice. Okay, this is one example of the kind of legend that arises, and legends of this sort are often the stuff of civic history, civic identity. Let's imagine we're trying to find someone who's a traveler. I was speaking with people before this got started, and people who have been traveling in various places. So let's try to imagine we're looking for a traveler in the late Middle Ages who's going to be doing a lot of travel around Western Europe. And what sorts of things will be of interest to him? To make it tough, let's not ask a cleric. Let's ask a layman. Let's ask an educated layman, say a doctor who has close connections with the humanists, okay? So this is a guy who's not going to fall prey to a lot of superstitious garbage. This is an educated guy who's going to want to take an interest in the real history of the places he visits. Guess what? We've got exactly that kind of person. This Hieronymus or Jerome Münzer, who in the late 15th century goes on a journey or pilgrimage, he calls it, from the city of Nuremberg and what's now southeastern Germany, all the way across into France, down along the coast of Spain, then back up through France and the Low Countries and back to Nuremberg. And he does this because there is a plague that has broken out, a pestilence, and he's afraid to stay in his own hometown of Nuremberg. He's a doctor, for heaven's sakes. He should have stayed put there. And you'd think that traveling around isn't the best way to contain the disease. But he wants to get out and see the world, and the plague becomes an excuse to travel. When he travels, what kind of stuff does he want to see? What does he look at? And how does he talk about it? Well, we have a lengthy description from his pen of where he goes and what he sees. He goes to Saint-Maximin in southeastern Germany, and there he sees the forearm and the arm bone of Blessed Maximin, also the head of a blind man whose sight was restored by God. He sees the arm of Mary Magdalene and the head of Mary Magdalene. That's what we see here. The head of Mary Magdalene, kept in a place furnished with strong bars and bolts in a gold and silver reliquary. To see this relic inspires awe, says Hieronymus Mincer. I believe there is not in the whole world a like divine evidence of the Catholic religion, because you can see on the front part of the skull on the left side, the flesh and the skin adhere to the bones in the very spot on which Christ touched her after the resurrection. The more passionately one has gazed on it, the more one is excited with spiritual awe. At the same time, says he, we saw a little glass vial in which there is sand from under the cross of Christ, sprinkled with the Lord's blood, collected by Mary Magdalene. And every Friday, the sand starts to bubble and to refill the vial with the color of blood. And this is held for a great and undoubted miracle. This is our rationalist, humanist, secular pilgrim. And he says, kind of in passing, oh, we circumambulated. We went around the chapel 3 times, and I hope that we gained a bunch of indulgences by doing that. He goes on to Arles. And in Arles, he sees the head of St. Anthony. And not only the head, but most of his other bones in a reliquary. And the monks at the shrine are displaying these relics with much pomp and chant. And he says, the head is to be venerated by the diligent observer who is affected with great awe as if struck by thunder. He goes on to Seville in southern Spain, and things are a bit different there because they haven't got as many relics. And in Seville, what they see is not so much relics, but holy images, including this and other images of the Virgin Mary, which have wondrous miracle-working properties. In a dream, King Ferdinand of Castile was instructed to go to a mosque and snatch an image of the Blessed Virgin, which had been taken over by the Saracens. He should redeem it from the Saracens. And if he did this and carried this image with him, he would get possession of the city of Seville. He would conquer the city of Seville. And if he took this image with him in battle, every time he went into battle, he would win. And guess what? He did that. And he did defeat the Moors because he had this miraculous image of the Virgin. And it was one of several images. In the later Middle Ages, there are plenty of places where they haven't got miracle-working relics, but you can always come up with a miracle-working image. Oddly, he went to Santiago de Compostela. For my 70th birthday, I did the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, 500 miles across northern Spain. And I experienced a miracle of St. James, 500 miles of walking without a single blister. That counts as a miracle. But this Hieronymus Mincer wasn't all that impressed. This is one of the major pilgrimage places in Western Europe. He's not terribly impressed. He says that you go there and there's this great clamor inside the church. He says people should venerate St. James more reverently than that. And he says, nobody's ever seen the body of St. James. It's inside this silver reliquary. Nobody's actually seen the body. Even the King of Castile, when he went there, didn't get to see the bones. And he ends up by saying, we believe only through faith. which is our salvation. I'm not sure exactly how to construe that, but when he moves on back to central Spain, to Guadalupe, yes, there's Guadalupe in Spain, and he sees another miraculous image, and he says, wow, this is great, this miraculous image. What else do we see at Guadalupe? Well, we see all sorts of great things. We see a large crocodile, which some people from Portugal were threatened by when they visited Africa. And through the prayers of the Blessed Virgin Mary, they were saved from this giant crocodile. Isn't that wonderful? 2 giant fins from a large whale. The size, he says, was unimaginable. A very long elephant's tusk. What's going on here? We've crossed over a boundary from relics and wonder-working images to a kind of cabinet of wonders, what the Germans call a Wunderkammer. And we see a kind of transposition of that sense of awe, that sense of reverence, that sense of wonder that you might have for a relic or a wonder-working image. And it's now transposed to a crocodile or a very large elephant's tusk. And it's a kind of secularization of the sacred, but the same sense of awe, the same sense of wonders carried over to this chamber, or this cabinet of wonders that he sees in Guadalupe. But for the most part, his reverence, his awe, his sense of the extraordinary power of things is reserved for things that he and his contemporaries defined as sacred. He goes to Saint Gilles and he says, how noble is that place, and to be reverenced by any Christian. He goes to another shrine and he says, to one who beholds it, the place is one of the greatest devotion. He's all the time going around to this place and that and comparing them with paradise. Paradise. The earthly paradise? No, I think the heavenly paradise. And that leads us on to something else. I want to devote the rest of the time here to comparing 2 cities, Florence in Tuscany and Bruges in Flanders. But before I get to this comparison, I want to say, by way of preface, that cities of this sort in the later Middle Ages tend to see themselves on the model of the heavenly city. If you look at the rhetoric they use, Book of Revelation, last book of the Bible, end of the book of Revelation, talks about the heavenly Jerusalem coming down to earth. And that heavenly Jerusalem, which is after all the model that people use to picture heaven itself, they tend to think, when they get really eloquent about talking about Florence or Bruges or other cities, they tend to say, that's the kind of ideal model of our own city. They tend to think of these cities not as smelly places where you're always running over sewage in the streets, but rather as the ideal location. Okay, when they wake up in the morning and have to drag themselves through the streets, get crammed with sewage, it's probably hard to see themselves as making their way through the heavenly Jerusalem. But when they're speaking in more exalted terms, when they're trying to convey a sense of what their cities are really ideally like, they do invoke that kind of vocabulary. Florence and Bruges, similarities and differences. Both fabulously wealthy. Where do they get their wealth? Largely from cloth, very largely from wool. There are complications here because Bruges's cloth industry is kind of waning at a time when Florence's is taking off. Let's not go into those complicating factors. But we have here the emblem of the wool workers guild in Florence. Notice it's a sacred emblem. It is Christ, the Lamb of God, whose wool is being taken to make the cloth. Symbolically, Christ stands for the lamb from which the wool is taken, because Christ himself is the Lamb of God. Think of any 2 places in the 14th, 15th centuries distinguished for the artists who lived there. it would be hard to find places more distinguished as centers of artistic production than Florence and Bruges. And I have given two images of the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary, one by Fra Angelico from Florence, the other by Hans Memling from Bruges. But these are simply standing in for a wealth of artistic production. And as I say, it'd be hard to find any other centers of artistic production that really rival Florence and Bruges. Florence and Bruges both claimed some measure of autonomy, Florence a lot more successfully than Bruges. They both had to contend with some claims to power from outside, because Florence was sandwiched between the Holy Roman Empire to the north and the Papal States to the south. And there were some people like Dante who sided with the Holy Roman Empire. We call them Ghibellines. There are some people who sided with the Pope and the Papal States. We call them Guelphs. And the political complications led to Dante's expulsion from the city of Florence. Let's not get into a lot of that. But if the city of Florence maintained its autonomy, its independence, it was in the face of expanding territorial and consolidating territorial claims from the north and the south. In the case of Bruges, it was chiefly the dukes of Burgundy who had claimed this patchwork of states, including the most important cities of Flanders, including Bruges. That didn't mean that the city of Bruges was totally swallowed up in the consolidated Duchy of Burgundy. There was always some jockeying for power, some attempt to reassert independence in this way or that. But there were cities with some measure of independence that had to be guarded carefully. Okay. Differences. Florence was the see of a bishopric. Bruges was not. There was the cathedral and the baptistry at Florence. And in principle, everyone was baptized in this baptistry, which meant that everyone in Florence had a connection with the core, the inner circle of ecclesiastical power in Florence. The cathedral and the baptistry were the undisputed centers of the sacred in Florence. There's nothing quite corresponding to that in Bruges, but there are complications there that we'll get to. Florence also, and we'll see more about this shortly, had a church of the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Servites and the Orsidians and the Carmelites and other mendicant friars. They exercised an influence in Florence. They were present in Bruges, but they didn't have anywhere near the same role in Bruges that they did in Florence. And we'll see more about that in a little while. What you find in Bruges is processions and more processions going on all the time, especially the procession of the Holy Blood. Bruges is a place where people are on the move, going through the town and outside the town with relics of various sorts, but especially this relic of Christ's own blood. And that's going to loom large as we proceed with this comparison. So, okay, first of all, the city of Florence. I'm going to be showing you a succession of maps. I'll try to work through this fairly economically because I don't want to dwell a lot on the historical particulars. But you need to know that the city of Florence, unlike Bruges, had been a city back in Roman times, in the Roman Empire. So it had deep roots. And the Christianity in Florence had deep roots. There have been Christians in Florence back to the days of persecution, the days of martyrdom. The Roman city, you can see the rectangle here, showing the first walls of the city of Florence. That's the way the Romans laid out their cities. But back when the city was first laid out, not a lot of questions. What you see here is the city walls superimposed on a modern map. Okay, so don't get confused. You see the modern cathedral, the later medieval cathedral, and a lot of later medieval stuff that wasn't there back in the first century. So the walls are superimposed on a modern map. By the time we have a Christian community in Florence, the city had shrunk in size and in population. It had shrunk considerably. And the Christian community that settled in early Florence was a Christian community that was very largely outside the city walls. Christianity was tolerated by the Emperor Constantine. It was made kind of the official religion of the Roman Empire by Theodosius. But that didn't necessarily mean the Christians everywhere were in advantageous positions. Yeah, the Christian community in Florence was just outside the walls by this point. And what we have here is, you can see the cathedral. That's not what the early cathedral looked like, but it was in that location. And we have the baptistry right beside it to the left, and San Lorenzo up a little bit to the upper left. Those provide the kind of core of the early Christian community in Florence. In that territory, a kind of Christian complex that mimics and means to supplant the pagan complex around the temple of Jupiter, the temple of Jove, in the center of Florence. We have old pagan Florence. Now this is the new Christian Florence. What would come to be the Cathedral of Florence was this early basilica of Santa Reparata, Saint Reparata. Where'd she come from? We'll get to that in a little while. And it is a classic Christian basilica. This is a reconstruction of what it would have looked like. Do we know really what it would have looked like? To some extent we do, because it's been excavated. We see here the rather wonderful mosaic work, including a list of the people who had provided money for the building of this basilica. There you see some of the work in color, including the peacock symbolizing immortality. But now let's get to the question, who is this Saint Reparata for whom the cathedral is named, to whom it is dedicated? And who are some of the other important patrons of early Florence? Saint Reparata never set foot in Florence. She was a martyr in Palestine, and something important happened on a feast day, so they were keen on her. Saint Minius, at least according to legend, if not historical fact, was from Armenia. He was a prince, maybe a king. Legend tends to vary. It is said that he served in the Roman army, and he was a martyr in the mid-3rd century. He is one of these martyrs who wouldn't take beheading for a final solution, like Saint Denis in Paris. After he had been beheaded, he reached down, picked up his head, and carried it off to the place where he wanted to be venerated. So he is the patron of San Miniato al Monte, a wonderful church up overlooking Florence. And then there's also Saint Zenobius, an early bishop of Florence, said to come from a family of Greek-speaking Syrians who had settled in Florence. So these three people all lived in, came from families that came from the Eastern Mediterranean or thereabouts. That's a way of declaring that the Christian community in Florence was cosmopolitan. It was connected with the Eastern Mediterranean, reasonably close to the Holy Land and places where there were very early Christian communities. That may be in part legendary, but the earliest Christian church in the Florence area actually has a lot of memorial inscriptions in its cemetery in Greek, indicating that there were a lot of Christians in Florence who came from the Eastern Mediterranean. As we move on into the early Middle Ages, we have new walls showing that the city is growing to the south and then up to the north. And before very long, we have the cathedral and the baptistry built right up against the walls. San Lorenzo is still outside the walls, but this gives a pretty good sense, this cutaway image, a pretty good sense of what the baptistry and the cathedral would have looked like in the period of the early transition from the early to the high Middle Ages. You will notice that at some point, probably around the 10th, 11th century, they built a larger baptistry than they had had earlier, and they had marble facing inside and out, Greek and white marble, which became characteristic of Florence, inside and out. And that kind of facing would eventually be put on the basilica, the cathedral as well. We're moving on here. The fifth walls from the 12th century, the city is growing by leaps and bounds. What has happened? And yeah, the city is incorporating, including within its walls, the Oltrarno on the other side of the Arno River. Now, all three of the major old monuments are incorporated within the walls: San Lorenzo, the cathedral, the baptistry. But there's something else that's really important going on here. In this period, in the 13th century, there are lots of people moving into Florence to work in the cloth industry. Yeah, to serve as combers or whatever in the wool industry and in related industries. These people coming from the countryside, they tend to settle in the suburbs. Are they slums? Well, to some extent, yes. They're somewhat sparsely populated, but they start to fill up. And there are a lot of dye works and other sorts of work that make these not entirely salubrious places to live, but there are people increasingly moving into these areas, workers moving into these areas. Who are the clergy who take care of them? Very largely, it's the friars, the mendicants, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, other friars. And they build their churches, for the most part, just outside the walls, where the workers live. They serve the working population that has immigrated into these areas around Florence. To some extent, the churches themselves are involved in industry. There are monasteries and friaries that are connected with the woolworking industry. They take care of the people. They provide employment for the people. Santa Maria Novella is, before very long, built on a massive scale, much larger than it had been before. It is the first truly monumental church in Florence, in this part of Italy, and other churches eventually in the 13th and early 14th centuries. They're not only founded, they grow. They become massive monumental churches. The friars and the monks are involved in civic life in many different ways. There are Cistercian monks who are in charge of supervising navigation in the Arno River. There are religious communities that are experts in wool processing. The Franciscans become arbiters in affairs of administration. The friars at Santa Maria Novella have a special apartment in their friary complex where distinguished visitors are brought in to stay. So the friars and the monks are deeply, deeply involved in the life of the community. Final walls, the sixth walls. And to give you a clear sense of the expansion of the walls, here's the comparison. The walls of 1172 with all of those immigrant population around the walls and all of the mendicant friaries and churches around the walls. Now all of that is incorporated in much more expansive walls in the late 13th century. These walls were eventually torn down, but a fragment of them survives. And you can see here right off the Viale Michelangelo, the walls of Florence from the late 13th century that do survive. I've already pointed out that these friaries are now within the walls. There's another one which becomes the center of the Reformed or observant Dominicans. Fra Angelico was there, Savonarola was there. Many distinguished people lived in these friaries, and many of the most distinguished artists did artwork for these friaries. Were there parish churches in Florence as well? Yes, of course there were. But apart from San Lorenzo, the parish churches tend not to be nearly so prominent. You more rarely hear of them. You more rarely see art displayed in them. They were there, they served the needs of people, but they weren't as fully integrated into the civic life of the community as the friaries, except for San Lorenzo. And San Lorenzo had the privilege of being the parish church of the Medici family. So it was prominent as the others were not. Okay, backing off, looking at Florence as a whole. This is the image which we used on the poster advertising this event. We used just a section of this. This is from a famous late 15th century world chronicle put out in Nuremberg. And it has these famous woodcut illustrations of different cities, Florence, Nuremberg, and other cities. Why is this important? This and this other representation of Florence are examples of something that you really do not have much of before. Fascination with the panorama of a city, with the effort to look at the city as a whole, to grasp the city as a whole, as if you were seeing the heavenly Jerusalem as a whole. And it's not surprising that Hieronymus Münzer, the traveler we talked about before, every time he went to a city, he would climb up the highest tower so he could look at the city as a whole. This is something you tend not to have in earlier periods, that drive to see, to grasp, to understand the city as an integral whole. But you could see it here in these panoramic representations of Florence. Let's come back now and look at the rebuilding of the cathedral. We have here, from near the end of our period, the old basilica with the new cathedral and the bell tower of Giotto being built around it. This gives you a sense of the scale, the old cathedral and the new cathedral. And this shows you what the new cathedral, how it's configured and how it stands in relationship to the baptistry. When the new cathedral was put up, it was declared by the commune, by the government, the Republic of Florence, that this would no longer be dedicated to Santa Reparata. You can still see the archaeological remains of the old cathedral underneath this cathedral. You can go down there and see the archaeological remains. But the commune decreed that the new cathedral should be dedicated not to that rather obscure saint, Saint Reparata, but rather to the Blessed Virgin Mary herself, Santa Maria del Fiore, Saint Mary of the Flower. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, the significance of the flower. Yeah, there have been books, including some very good popular books about Brunelleschi's dome, which is this marvelous engineering feat, as well as an artistic feat. It is conceived as a symbol of Mary's crown. So Mary enters in through the dome itself. The bell tower put up by Giotto, the baptistry. Incidentally, why is it dedicated to St. John the Baptist, San Giovanni? Well, for two reasons. He is the Baptist, so a baptistry is naturally named for him. But then also you tend to find the churches in wool areas that produce the wool or work the wool, are often dedicated to St. John the Baptist because he is the one who identified Christ as the Lamb of God. So he is associated with wool. The new cathedral. If you go to Santa Maria Novella, the so-called Spanish chapel, there is this extraordinary wall painting which shows an image, kind of mystical, rosy image of the cathedral. It's not naturalistic color, but it is an image which has a pope and a bishop and a cardinal and various other dignitaries, as if the entire church is gathered here under the shadow of this new cathedral. The cathedral symbolizes the city, it symbolizes the broader church. And here we have another wall painting showing Saint Zenobius holding a model of the new cathedral. This is a wonderful image because it brings together the old and the new, that age-old Syro-Grecan bishop who ruled in the early years of the Florentine church, holding the model of the new cathedral. This is a fascinating image. This is an image of Dante holding his Divine Comedy, and there he is with hell to our left, purgatory in the background, and the city of Florence with the great dome arising to the right. Now, how do you want to interpret that? It's ambiguous. You can say that the progression is from below to above, from hell to purgatory to heaven. And we have the stars of heaven up above. But you can also construe it, and this may seem more natural, as going from left to right, in which case the city of Florence and the cathedral, the dome especially, become a symbol of the heavenly Jerusalem, planted here on earth. Would Dante have been happy thinking that Florence was symbolizing the heavenly Jerusalem? Absolutely not. Yeah, Dante had nothing but scathing words for the city of Florence, which had expelled him. but Florence always wanted to reclaim him. And I tend to think that's what's going on here, that Florence is representing itself as an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, even if Dante would have said, no, 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 no. Yeah, here we have images of the Last Judgment and the heavenly Jerusalem. It was commonplace to picture heaven as a city. So why not Florence as the heavenly Jerusalem? Okay, now back to the flower. Back to the flower. This is the flag of the Florentine Republic from the mid-13th century onward. And it shows the Florentine lily, which was adopted by the one party, the Guelphs, the pro-papal party. The name Florence does come from a Latin word having to do with flower. Exactly why it was named that back in the Roman Empire, there are different theories, but it is the florid city in some sense or other. And it never lost that sense of its connection with flowers. So here we have the flag of the city itself showing this lily and the Virgin Mary. Well, it's not only in Florence, it's kind of all over. She's associated with flowers, but all the more here in Florence. It's kind of hard to escape the connection between Mary and flowers. In this image, she's holding a flower and she has more flowers at her feet. In this image, you have flowers all around her. Yes, she is often depicted as the Virgin Annunciate. Yes, she is also the Virgin who is carried into heaven. But when Florentines thought about the Virgin Mary, they tended to think of her as their Virgin Mary, the Virgin with the flower, the Virgin who held the flower that was associated with the city of Florence itself. Saint Reparata was a venerable old saint, locally venerated, not hugely popular, not very well known. And it was characteristic in the later Middle Ages for people to become somewhat more fascinated with the universal saints, especially the most universal saints, the Virgin Mary, always with some kind of local twist, some kind of local inflection. So you could have this shrine or that shrine, this Black Madonna, that Black Madonna. This was the universal patroness, but she always had some particular local connection, some local inflection. Something else that was going on in Florence, I've emphasized over and over again, the church in Florence is closely connected with the city as a whole, the commune, the republic as a whole. But there are also the wealthy families, the patrician and noble families that established their own chapels in these churches, especially in the friars' churches, Santa Maria Novella and the other friars' churches. So there's a kind of tug of war going on here. Yes, the church is public. Yes, the community as a whole patronizes the church, but the families also have their private spaces in these churches, a tug of war between the public and the private, the communal and the familial. So to sum up, in Florence, we have deep, deep, deep historical roots with a lasting cult of relatively little known saints overlaid by a cult of the universal patroness. Given local inflections, she is the Virgin Mary of the flower which is the city of Florence. There's a strong sense of connection between the city itself, the Republic of Florence, and the church, partly offset toward the end by these private spaces put in by the wealthiest families. Let's look at Bruges. First thing you notice about Bruges is that it doesn't have nearly the same kind of historical depth. It was not a city in the Roman Empire. It was not a city in the age of the martyrs. The earliest thing we have here is from the 10th century. It does go back a little bit before that. But you have the collegiate church of St. Donatian, right in the center. Right near that is the Basilica of the Holy Blood and other places strewn here and there in the city of Bruges, but they don't have nearly the same antiquity. Let's look at the core. St. Donatian, the collegiate church. Who was St. Donatian? He was a bishop of Reims in northern France, and his bones had somehow made their way up into Belgium, and they were brought to Bruges by a community of monks. Yeah, it's not exactly the sort of thing we would normally use as a hostess present. Here, have the body of some old saint. But this community of monks brought the relics of St. Donatian, and they were cherished as the main human relics of the city of Bruges. I say the main human relics because before very long, the city of Bruges had another kind of relic. It had a vial of Christ's blood. Now, I read you before, this Hieronymus Münzer saw in southern France a little vial of the blood of the Christ, which Mary Magdalene had collected from the foot of the cross. Okay, Joseph of Arimathea had collected some of Christ's blood, and somehow in the 12th century, there was a Count of Flanders who was a pilgrim and a crusader who brought this vial of Christ's blood collected by Joseph of Arimathea, brought it back with him and donated it to the people of Bruges. That's an even better hostess present. And it became the chief relic for the Basilica of the Holy Blood up in the upper part of this picture. You can see that both of these dominant ecclesiastical institutions are right by the town hall. The most important institutions are often close by the town hall because they tend to be closely linked with the city government. This shows you the basilica where the relic of the Holy Blood is preserved, and then down below the entrance off to the right to that basilica. It is a highly, highly ornate structure. This is one of the two major parish churches of Bruges, and we'll talk a little bit about parish churches later on. Church of Our Lady. For now, what I chiefly want to emphasize about this Church of Our Lady, you can't really see it, but on the picture on the right, the picture of the interior, if you could look up on the upper level toward the left, you would see the reverse view of this. There was an aristocratic family that had its townhouse in Bruges, the Groothuis family. They had a mansion right by this church, and they built their private oratory, their private chapel in their mansion, but they built it as a kind of connecting bridge between their mansion and the parish church. So you could go into your own private oratory to pray, your private chapel, and look down through this window and see what was going on inside the church. Talk about separation of public space and private space. Well, that distinction is pretty much obliterated here. The other parish church, St. Salvator, we'll talk more about that in just a little while. We have here three main ecclesiastical centers: St. Donation, the collegiate church with a college or community of priests, and then the parish churches of Our Lady and St. Salvator. Notice St. Mary is named for the universal patroness, Mary the Virgin. St. Salvator is the Savior, Christ. I want to say a little bit about not just these institutions. The collegiate church of St. Donation was destroyed by the French revolutionaries when they were occupying Bruges at the end of the 18th century. So we haven't got photographs of that. But these three institutions we know a fair amount about. There were other places around Bruges that don't survive. We don't have images of them. There were almshouses all over the place. There were chapels all over the place. There were houses of friars, which do not survive. There were three new parish churches. Everywhere you went, you stumbled upon sacred architecture. What was done in the sacred architecture? Well, let me just mention briefly that if you look at the records for these three churches especially, you find lots and lots of evidence that lay people all over Florence, to the extent that they had the financial means, were providing money for the enrichment of liturgy. What did that mean? You've got a saint you're fond of. You want that saint's feast day to be properly celebrated. You give money for a procession. You give money for a sermon. You give money for embellished music, motets, polyphonic music. You give money for all sorts of, for bell ringing. Yeah, you have to pay people to do all these things. And those endowments are made, they're recorded, and they give testimony to a lively, lively interest in among the people of Bruges in enhancing, glorifying the ordinary liturgy of these parish churches and the collegiate church. And then, of course, there are memorial masses for the dead. Those who are rich enough can afford to have masses celebrated for their souls in perpetuity, in principle. Those who aren't wealthy enough can arrange for some masses to be celebrated for their souls. A lot of chapels, a lot of altars exist for that purpose. celebrating Mass for the souls of the deceased. Wait a minute. Oh, of course, it's upside down. This is not the first time in my career I've done that. Something else that survives in Bruges is the beguinage or Kieckhefer. There were women who wanted to live in religious community, who didn't want to take vows and become nuns. They wanted to have the freedom to come and go, to leave the communities if they so choose. And they became beguines, and they lived pious lives. They did handiwork to support themselves. They had their own chapel that they prayed in. They were sort of like nuns, but not quite nuns. And this community of beguines in Bruges survived into the 20th century. The buildings still survive, reasonably well intact, and you can see they have a fairly substantial chapel, which is still used as a church. There were almshouses, there were hospitals in Bruges, numerous hospitals and almshouses. Probably the most famous of the hospitals is the hospital dedicated to St. John, famous among other things because in the 15th century, the artist Hans Memling was commissioned to do works of art for this hospital, and there are works of his which are still inside the place that they were intended for. One of the most famous is this altarpiece of the two Saints Catherine, which shows, there's two Saints John, St. Catherine is toward the center, but the two Saints John, St. John the Baptist to the left, St. John the Evangelist, this glorious scene of St. John the Baptist, the Evangelist, looking at the scene of the book of Revelation, the apocalypse at the end of time on the right-hand side of this triptych. People who went to the Holy Land often came back and attempted to recreate the Holy Land at home for their own purposes or for the purposes of local pilgrims. And the Adornis family was an Italian family that settled in Bruges. They had been to the Holy Land. They came back in the 15th century. They built what they took to be an authentic replica of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. If you've been to Jerusalem, you realize it doesn't look anything like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it's been argued you were supposed to have the sense of being there. You're supposed to be there in the dark with a torch, the way you would see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at night with a torch. You're supposed to feel your way around. You're supposed to smell the wax. You're supposed to have the sense of being in a church like the Holy Sepulchre. And as at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, here in Bruges, you had the inner sanctum. You crouched down, went through this low passageway, and you saw Christ, or an image of Christ, there behind that grate, buried in the Holy Sepulchre, there in your own city of Bruges. But there were images of this, replicas of the Holy Sepulchre all over the place. Okay, now, the thing that made Bruges really famous from a religious perspective, the thing that put it on the map, the thing that really gave it allure to people inside the city and outside the city was the Holy Blood procession. I've already told you they claim to have a relic of Christ's blood. And beginning in the late 13th century, every year, they would take this relic of Christ's blood out on a processional route. And they still do that. And beginning in the the early 14th century, this procession was heavily subsidized by the city government. And the city government, along with the canons of St. Donation, kind of coordinated how the pilgrimage, how the processional route went, who got to march where, what kind of livery they were required to wear, what kind of pageant wagons would be featured in this procession. We don't have photographs of the procession as it was celebrated in the 14th century. We do have lots of photographs that show how it is done now. And the way it would have been done then would be something like the way it is done now in the 21st century. So this gives you a sense of the richness, the splendor, the effort, the time, the money that is put into this. And again, it is a civic procession largely subsidized by the city government. This plan shows you the route that the Holy Blood procession would take. This bit of zooms in. And the heavy dotted line that starts out in the center of town, the Basilica of the Holy Blood, comes out toward the bottom, goes out a city gate, stops at each of the city gates, comes around back in, and there are various stations inside the city. It is declaring the city as a whole to be a sacred city. But there are other processions. There are general processions. There are Corpus Christi processions. There are Rogation. There are processions all the time. But in the city of Bruges, you could call a general procession for any of various purposes. In a general procession, the smaller dots indicate one of the routes, much more limited. This goes around the center of the city, but it may go in any of various directions. What were these general processions for? Well, how good of you to ask that question. Much of the time, they were for the benefit of the prince. Who's the prince? They could be for the weather, if there was a lot of stormy weather destroying the crops of the countryside, or they could be for peace. Now, that brings us to a really important factor here. I mentioned early on that Bruges, like Florence, sought to claim some measure of autonomy in its affairs. But there was somebody who claimed authority over Bruges. Yeah, the Counts of Flanders, and then later, at the end of the Middle Ages, the Dukes of Burgundy. And the Dukes of Burgundy, the Counts of Flanders and then the Dukes of Burgundy, would often come in to the city, and they would be greeted in solemn procession as they made their way in through the city gates. And they would be told as they were coming in through the city gates that they were entering into a kind of earthly replica of the heavenly Jerusalem. And when they came in, they were recognized as the effective rulers of the city of Bruges. There were some in Bruges who resisted, and there were moments when the city of Bruges rebelled against the authority of the Dukes of Burgundy. There were some in the city of Burgundy who wanted to side rather with the kings of France as a kind of guarantee against the power of Burgundy. So they're jockeying for power back and forth, people playing off the two major consolidating territories. But the rulers of Burgundy and of France were like rulers anywhere, trying to consolidate their power, and the city of Bruges attempted to resist. And both the assertion of authority and the resistance to that authority were expressed in ceremonial terms, by the grand ceremonial procession into the city, by the rituals of transmission of power, the oath-taking the people would take. All of that was ritualized. In Bruges, we have a strong focus on liturgical time. Of course, you have that everywhere. You have the holy days, the feast days, the saints' feast days, but it's more public, it's more in your face in the city of Bruges because of the Holy Blood procession and because of all of that liturgical elaboration that people are devoting money to. Now, another factor that's important in Bruges is this balance of power. Yeah, the city wanting to exert as much autonomy as it can in the face of consolidating, centralizing authority, in particular from the Counts of Flanders, then the Dukes of Burgundy. Now, that gives you some of the factors that give these cities a kind of religious aura, a kind of allure, that make the cities sacred places for insiders and for outsiders. There are other factors that you can see perhaps better in other cities. This is a rich subject with many more variations. And if you come back in 2 weeks, you will see some more of those variations. Okay, thank you. We have time for questions.
Yes, thank you. I will walk around with the microphone. And I also do have one question so far on the Zoom, which I'll start with that one. Excuse me. Has your career of research and discovery on this subject changed your views on religious life and spirituality?
Wow. Let me answer that by talking about my experience on the Camino, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. When you are doing the Camino, people will ask other people why you're doing it. They'll ask questions about your religion, questions about your politics, questions about your health. Any question is fair on the Camino. But one question that gets asked all the time is, why are you doing the Camino? And people do it for a wide variety of reasons. I considered the Camino to be a religious or spiritual exercise. More important than anything else to me was a sense of continuity with generations, with centuries of people who have done the Camino. I had a sense of being bonded with those generations of prior pilgrims, and that sense of connectedness to all of those people is, to me, a spiritual experience. Okay, so let's say I'm not on Camino. I'm going to be in Budapest next month. I'll be stopping off in Germany. I'm revisiting friends, people I haven't seen for decades, going to places I haven't seen for a long time. And for me, seeing my friends and revisiting old places, places that are familiar to me, but places that kind of have this kind of deep heritage, I think of that as a spiritual experience. A kind of deep grounding in tradition. Does that kind of answer the question?
I hope so. It was somebody online, so we'll see. I think it was a fellow emeritus. We might find out. Who else has a question?
You mentioned earlier in your talk the reality of the pagan derivation or the pagan background to those areas, and I'm curious the degree to which the pagan moved into the deeper background, or what would be kind of the demographics of that reality back then, and then to what degree did the Protestant Reformation bring a change to what you're discussing at this point?
Okay, two questions. The pre-medieval question, the post-medieval question. There are many places in Spain and southern France where you see the Black Madonna. And the earliest examples we have are wooden statues that are painted black. My crazy theory, we're all entitled to our crazy theories. My crazy theory is that those wooden images are based on stone prototypes. And there are lots of places where stone is itself sacred. At Le Puy, you go into the lower level of the cathedral, there is a slab of kind of black rock, which people come in and venerate. It's not carved into anything, it's just a rock. And there are other places in France, Spain, Germany, where it's clear the rock is itself sacred. And I'm thinking these Black Madonnas were probably originally carved of the black rock, made Christian by being carved into an image of the Virgin Mary. Now, there are plenty of places also, especially in northern Spain, I saw some of these on the Camino, where the image of the Virgin was found inside a cave or a grotto, brought out, put into a church, miraculously returned to her place of origin, was brought out again, miraculously returned, and somehow they persuaded her, they coaxed her out, or else they built a church around the grotto, because she's the earth goddess, okay? There's something chthonic about her. She's the earth goddess. So I have no trouble at all seeing devotion to the Virgin Mary as getting linked with that cult, the kind of cult. Now, does that mean that that's originally what she was? No, I think Jesus had a mother, and his mother did not start out in life as an earth goddess, but she took on that character. And there's a lot of stuff that you could refer to as pagan. It kind of becomes folkloric. There are lots of places around Tuscany where you see on the churches, statuaries, all kinds of stuff that has no obvious connection with Christianity. Bowls and serpents and sirens, especially sirens, the double-tailed sirens. What kind of saint is that? Well, it's not a saint, but it's a folkloric image. Can you call it pagan? Well, I mean, it's not obviously connected with any sort of pagan mythology or pagan cult, but it's pre-Christian and folkloric, and I'm not keen on making sharp distinctions here.
Hi, I have, can you hear me?
Mhm.
I have like a question. I've been to the cathedral in Florence, and an observation was the baptistry to me seemed huge. Really, really big relative to the church. And I was just wondering, you said that everyone in Florence got baptized at that baptistry. Was that true? And why was it so big? Since baptism is a pretty quick process and you're dunked in a tub and then you're on your way, right? The second observation I had was you made a comment about the Virgin Mary and the flower, okay, regarding the cathedral.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about Paris, and I'm thinking about Notre Dame and the Fleur de Lis, okay, of France. And it almost feels like this is a universal thing going on throughout Europe, this adoration of the Virgin Mary and the connection with the flower. So just,
Yeah, well, I said there's a connection with flowers. Often there's a lily at the scene of the Annunciation, as a symbol of her purity, her virginity. But the Florentines get particularly carried away with it and have her holding a flower, have flowers all around her. And what's most important there is that when she's holding a flower in Florence, it's the name of the city. So there's a connection between the Virgin, the flower, and the city that doesn't hold up in Paris. We'll talk about Paris in a couple of weeks. Actually, somebody asked about the Reformation. Yeah, the reformers were not keen on pilgrimages. Depends on which reformers you're speaking of course. But even before the reformers, Erasmus was not really keen on. There were a lot of critics of pilgrimage in the late Middle Ages. A lot of people who thought that if you wanted to live a good, pious life, you could stay home and be a good Christian. So there was that kind of reformist critique even before the reformers. Let me simplify by saying, for Martin Luther, much of the stuff that we've been talking about, he could tolerate. He could tolerate images. He could tolerate a lot of the ceremonial of the church. So long as you didn't think that you were gaining favor, that you were gaining merit in the eyes of God by doing these things. If you donated money to a church, fine. If you donated money to have a painting done, preferably a painting that was in keeping with his theology, painting of the law and the gospel, for example. He was really keen on that iconography. And he didn't mind the saints so much, so long as, first of all, you didn't think of them as a kind of special category of Christians. He believed in a kind of spiritual democracy in heaven. And as long as you didn't venerate them the way Catholics did. So he was willing to tolerate a lot. Other reformers, not so much, but those are complications. Oh, wait a minute, that was the good person on Zoom. That was not you. We've got too many balls in the air here. I don't think I answered everything you asked. Okay, fine.
You mentioned a number of times the difference between the fact that one city was Roman and one city didn't have any Roman heritage. Could you maybe speak to and I know this using the word Celts is quite lazy because it's an area basically of that wasn't Roman. Could you maybe speak to the Celtic heritage of the city of Bruges?
Don't see a lot of Celtic connections there. There were a lot of places in Western Europe, extending into Germany, where they had Irish monks who moved in. So patron saint of the city of Nuremberg is Saint Sebald. What do we know about Saint Sebald? Nothing, basically. So they invented a legend of Saint Sebald, which was very largely borrowed from other saints' legends, including some legends from Irish saints. And there were nearby monasteries that had been founded by the Irish. So the theory is that's how they knew about these legends. Other than that, surely there was a very
Celtic leaders that stood up to the Romans that kind of formed, I guess, the national ethos that I guess now is the lowlands of Europe or the lowlands of Europe. Does that not really affect that city?
I don't see that
Oh.
in these cities. No.
Thank you very much for your talk. So you're talking about the period of 1100 to 1400, right, or 1500. And during that time was the Black Death. So how did that affect all of this other church stuff and town council stuff? Because that would be overlaying it all, I would think.
Yeah, a lot has been written about the impact of the Black Death, say, on religious art and the connection between the Black Death and increasing what seems to us a kind of morbidity in the art of the late Middle Ages. A lot of representation of death, the memento mori, the decaying body, and so forth. I suppose from our perspective, what's most important is, remember I showed you that image of the Virgin Mary hovering over the city of Siena, extending a protective mantle. And in that particular case, she's protecting a city against earthquake. But I mentioned she also protects it against plague, famine, warfare. So there are many different kinds of plague saints. Saint Sebastian, Saint Roch are the most obvious plague saints, but there are other plague saints, including the Virgin Mary. And there's a lot of devotion to the saints as protectors against the plague. But then it's not the only disaster. It's the most obvious disaster. The saints get invoked against flood and famine, and just disasters of all sorts.
Professor, we have another, we're in the, they're in the corner.
I was fascinated by your map of the walls moving in Florence. And so the Roman walls, I understood. And then you talked about them moving basically toward the river in about the 6th century or so. And I was wondering, and you gave the impression that somehow there was this conflict between the Christians and the pagans. Were there actually pagans there, or was it really just because they were destroyed by the Goths or somebody? And then you had to rebuild closer to the river because it was more practical to be close to the river? Or?
No, the point there was simply when the Christians built their complex of churches in the baptistry just outside the north wall, and then eventually the wall came to incorporate it, they were establishing a Christian complex that seemed to mimic the older pagan complex around the great temple of Jove. But that's not as if over the centuries there was continuing pagan presence. I didn't mean to suggest that.
Okay.
Have time for one more question. Ready? Lots of good questions. And I think that's it. Wonderful. I think we were done.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Of May. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.